Air New Zealand has a lot on its plate, including engine issues, meaning aircraft, like the one behind me, are out of action. Why the CEO is adamant on it remaining an international airline.
We are still making money on these routes, but nowhere near the extent that we needed to, and actually not really enough to cover the cost of capital.
Would you ever consider getting out of international if it's not making much money?
We'll just go out. You got something in the hangar out here?
Yes. Oh, cool. The Chief Executive of Air New Zealand, Greg Foran, is taking us inside the airline's hangar at Auckland Airport.
This is a brand new A321 with no engines.
It's one of many aircraft the company can't fly because of engine issues. More are parked in the desert in Alice Springs.
Can you imagine how I feel? Four planes stuck in the desert.
It gives the vibe of COVID. There's aircraft there, unable to be used, even though you're allowed to fly them now.
I know.
You look like a frustrated man.
It is what it is.
The issues with Rolls-Royce and Pratt & Whitney engines is wiping millions from the airline's earnings potential. Its engineering team are working here 24/7. But it's not the worst time to have aircraft out of action. Travel demand is down markedly in this economy, especially domestically.
Government, as I mentioned, is down about 28% on a year ago. Corporate and small medium enterprises are down about 10 to 12%.
Air New Zealand's latest operating statistics show group capacity was down 8% in July compared to the same time last year. Revenue earned on all short-haul routes, that's around the country, across the Tasman and to and from the Pacific Islands, is down a collective 4% on a year ago. Long haul is up slightly thanks to Asia, but the Americas are struggling, with competition coming in hot. Qantas, United and Delta are all flying to the US from Auckland direct, and Jetstar just added flights from Hamilton to Australia daily. That competition will be putting pressure on airfares for those international routes, but domestically, Air New Zealand almost holds a monopoly, and customers are complaining about the cost. The airline argues its own costs have risen, more than 20% in the past 5 years. In this interview, Greg Foran explains the impact its pricing is having on demand and why it's bothering to be an international airline at all in this economy. Thank you for doing this, Greg. Good to see you again.
My pleasure.
We only just did this recently. You're back again, back for more.
I must have enjoyed it.
I hope so. I hope you enjoy this one too. I'm going to start with a pretty broad question. We're going to start big. What's your vision for our national carrier?
Be the airline that Kiwis would like to call their own. So that's what I would like to leave as my legacy, and an airline that Kiwis are proud of, that they would like to call their own. Specifically, to become a world-leading digital airline. So, that's, I think, a plank that then layers into an airline that we're all very proud of.
I like it. We'll come back to that later on. If we look at the business of an airline,
yep.
It's not easy. It's pretty complex. You have a lot of safety and regulation. You have charges that you have to pay to airports. You have expensive aging assets being aircraft. And in your case, you have a bit of government ownership involved. And also, in most cases, a pretty heavily unionised workforce. What does, in the best case scenario, a highly efficient airline look like on a cost base and revenue making level?
Look, I would say to you first of all that if you go back over the history of airlines, they're pretty difficult organisations to run, and the reason is a lot of the points that you just made. If you have a look at Michael Porter's 5 forces, are there substitutes readily available? In a lot of cases there are. You can jump in a car, or in parts of the world you can jump on a train or whatever. What's the power of buyers like, in other words, customers? Well, in a lot of cases, it's actually quite high. 2/3 of our business is international. There's 32 flights to China a week at the moment. Pick your airline, pick your flight, and off you go. It's why airlines run loyalty programs, because the power of the buyer is quite high. What's the ability to negotiate with your key suppliers? Limited. You can buy a Boeing or you can buy an Airbus. If you're into turboprops, you can buy ATR. De Havilland have stopped making the Q300. So, I could go through the other components, but they're difficult businesses because you don't control a lot of the aspects. So what you've got to do is make sure that you manage the bits that you can control extremely well. So try and get every bit of revenue you can out of the business. Try and then maintain your costs down as low as you possibly can, appreciating that fuel can be anything from sort of 20 to 30% of your cost base, highly unionised, plenty of regulation across all aspects of it, whether it's the Civil Aviation Authority or the FAA in the United States. So you've got to take close control of all those levers and make sure you manage them all very carefully.
One of the things you can control to some degree is your network. I want to talk about international quite heavily because, as you said, it's 2/3 of your business, but a lot of conversation about domestic at the moment. The numbers are pretty complex. We know that demand is down heavily. You told me that very recently, but if I look at your revenue numbers on the domestic network, they're up. So bottom line, is your domestic network profitable?
Not as good as what it was. And you can see that in the broad numbers, whilst we don't separate that out in terms of, domestic and international. You can assume that what you're seeing is, an increase in fares over a period of time, and that's not surprising because we've got costs that are going up pretty significantly. I just got back from Vancouver last week and was meeting with the owner of De Havilland, which actually makes the Q300s. Costs for parts are just going through the roof. It's just one component of it, but we're also dealing with airports. We're dealing with the cost of catering, of dry cleaning, all the things that everyone is dealing with in their life. We're seeing in airlines probably at a greater rate. And that means the only way you can make a profit is to basically get your revenue up. And so we've had to look at things like ancillary revenue and look at the base fares. So I'm not surprised that the revenue is up, but the issue is the costs are up even more.
How do you think about pricing? I know that this is a very controversial topic that you have to answer a lot of the time, but I'm just keen to understand how you think about that. Because if you increase pricing of airfares to a point, then where do you think that actually impacts demand and starts turning people off using your service? Do you think you're at that point now?
Oh, I would say we are at that point. And it even gets a little bit more complex when you think about the domestic business, because a reasonable proportion of that will be, say, government spend. And, I've spoken about the fact that we've seen a tightening in the economy, government departments have been told to pull back. So we're seeing spend in the government sector down consistently 28 to 30% week on week. So that's a pretty significant amount. But what's more important there is that that's a group of people who tended to book late and therefore paid higher fares. So what happens is that the mix in your business changes. It's not only the fact you've got less people flying, but the people who were flying tended to pay more because they booked late and wanted flexibility. Corporate, small, medium enterprises are down 10 to 12%. Again, not all that surprising. When you get around town and you just get a sense of what people are living with at the moment, mortgage rates, all those things. It's not surprising that we're seeing a little bit tougher there. It's cyclical. That will come back. So I'm not too worried about it. You've just got to make sure that you make really good decisions during this period. And that's something that I ask the team to do all the time is, even though it is tight and it is tough, make good decisions you're going to be proud of in a year's time and 5 years' time.
Okay, so domestic is profitable, although not as profitable as you'd like. Is the international network profitable, Greg?
So once again, it depends where you're looking at.
As the long haul
as
total,
a total
is it making
business,
or losing money?
we're okay with where we're sitting.
That's not a making or losing. Is it up or down?
It's not making as much as it was the previous year. The previous year we made $585 million. This last year we've come in with, $222 million. So you can see that right across the board, we won't have generated the same type of returns, whether it's international, whether it's domestic, whether it's cargo. we are still making money on these routes, but nowhere near the extent that we needed to, and actually not really enough to cover the cost of capital. But you can break down international and you can say, well, so what's happening around the place? You know, I went on holiday and I went to Tokyo, and I can see that you've put more seats onto Tokyo, and that's fantastic. And the answer is, yes, it is good. The yen is down. People in New Zealand are looking for somewhere to go. Less of them are going to China, less of them are going to Hong Kong, and more of them are going up to Japan. In the US, we're dealing with about 52% more seats than we would normally expect on those particular routes. So guess what? Fares are down there and we're not getting the returns we want to. Once again, it's cyclical, it'll work its way through.
Well, as you mentioned, the cost of capital is obviously higher for these international routes. You've got to send more staff, have them on the ground for longer, and somewhere expensive like New York where you have flights. But a lot of those are half empty, so I'm told. Is it worth Air New Zealand being an international business? Would you ever consider getting out of international if it's not making much money?
Well, never is one of those words that I always try and avoid, Madison, because I've learned over the years that, you know, don't back yourself into a corner on that. But I can tell you categorically we have no intention of really making any dramatic changes to our international network. Actually, we see opportunities to do a little bit more. But we're also very cautious because, you know, it's an area where the competition is fierce. You're up against a lot of sovereign carriers out there. So you've got to be careful. But we like where we fly to. We like the fact that the United States is pretty core to us. We like what we do as we head up into Asia. Obviously, Australia is critical for us, the Pacific Islands. And we'll consider to look at selectively where else we can take the business, but in a very sort of measured and appropriate manner.
Just to ask that in a sort of another roundabout way, why should Air New Zealand be an international airline? Why can't it just be a domestic airline with code shares around the world, for example?
Well, we do have code shares, as you can imagine, with many airlines as part of Star Alliance. And we also have some alliance arrangements, you know, particularly with United and Singapore. But, you know, it's a pretty regulated industry, so you just can't go out there and do deals with anyone and everyone. They've got to be signed off by not only the Ministry of Transport here in this country, but also by the appropriate administration in the country that you're flying to. So, you know, the world wants airlines to be competitive, and trust me, they are competitive. And so, you know, you've got to be thoughtful about that. Why would we want to fly to some of those locations? You know, number one, it's part of our purpose, connecting the world in terms of people. Number two, we've got a responsibility to move cargo in this country, and we move a reasonable amount of that. And number three, there are actually routes that are pretty good for us. And so, you know, I back ourselves when, you know, we've got good product, we've got tremendous people, and I get plenty of feedback from not just people in New Zealand, but people outside of New Zealand who travel with us and say, you know what, you run a great airline, so please keep flying. We're going to continue to support you.
It sounds like from that answer, Greg, that some of it is commercial, obviously, on some routes, but a lot of it's also just economic charity, in a way.
I wouldn't say that at all. You know, there's no point in running a business unless you make a profit so you can continue to invest in. What I will tell you is that profitability on routes changes. You know, unlike a business that I used to be in, which was retail, you put down a physical store on the corner of Main and Central, and there it sat for 20 or 30 or 40 years. I'm now in a business where you've got a $180 or $200 million piece of machinery that can move. You know, we can decide to point that machinery to South America, or we can decide to point it up to Asia. And so can your competitors. So what happens is what was a particularly profitable area can change and does change. So you've got to keep a reasonably open mind. You know, when I look back on some of the areas that Air New Zealand was flying to 20 years ago, you know, I think we were flying into Frankfurt, for example. Now, is Frankfurt on the list of places that I'm heading back to immediately? No, it isn't. You know, just as I started, we were going into Argentina. We pulled out of that route. Would we never go back there? I would never say never, as I said. Don't have an intention to get back there soon. Is India on the cards at some stage? You'd think it probably should be. And
My audience wants to ask you that question. It is?
Yeah. So we're thinking about that and how we might do that. You know, we've got Air India, they're part of Star Alliance. Do you head down the path of setting something up there? Those are the sort of things that we're thinking about.
Should we talk about fleet? For years, Air New Zealand has been simplifying its fleet. By the early 2030s, it plans to only operate one type of wide-body, Boeing 787 Dreamliners. It already only operates Airbus for its narrow-body fleet, and just 2 types of smaller turboprops domestically. The call to modernise the airline's assets has led to a concentration of certain engines. The ones manufactured by Rolls-Royce and Pratt & Whitney have had surprise maintenance schedule changes, meaning Air New Zealand has 10 aircraft out of operation at the moment. And that's impacting its earnings. It claims it would have made an extra $100 million in the financial year just ended if its entire fleet was in the air. But it's not unusual for airlines to have some aircraft undergoing maintenance or otherwise at any given time. But the scale of Air New Zealand's issues are bigger than most. With its capacity set to be constrained for another year at least, it may miss out further when demand for travel bounces back.
You know, as I think about the fleet, we needed a period where, as we dealt with COVID, where capacity was down, and then we've always had every intention to get out there and grow, and whether that growth is sort of 3% a year or 4% a year, that's always been our intention. Challenge we've got, we just can't get hold of the machinery at this point. But that'll get sorted and it will come.
Aircraft out of action at the moment, 10 of them out of your control because of these engine issues. Can't you wet lease or dry lease aircraft? Are you considering doing that to a larger degree?
We have. We've not only done that, we've actually acquired more aircraft as well. So we've currently got 3 777s that we weren't planning to have in the lease. Those are actually planes that used to fly for Cathay Pacific, and they've gone back to their lessor, and we've said, thank you very much, we'll grab those 3. And many of our customers will have travelled on those and got on them and gone, gee, this isn't an Air New Zealand plane, and the answer is no, it's an older Cathay Pacific plane. But we needed those extra seats. We've got some extra A320s from Airbus. We've held back on sending some planes back. We've ordered some more. We've got 2 more coming in about April next year. We've got 2 more ATRs coming. We wet lease a plane, and we ran that for the best part of a year on Auckland to Perth. So we've sort of pulled every single lever we can and continue to pull them as we deal with something which, frankly, is going to be around for at least another couple of years.
Do you get compensated by the manufacturer? To what degree? Fully for loss of earnings and lack of capacity growth?
Not anywhere near it. And you know, I'll speak a little bit about that and then give you an example of how this plays out. So, you know, we said when we put our results out just a month or so ago, we know that we're impacted to the tune of about $100 million worth of hard costs. And they're things like leasing these 777s, you know, they're not cheap. So we get some compensation, but nowhere near enough to even cover the hard costs.
How much of the 100 mil do you get back?
We don't share that. That's a negotiation that we do with the manufacturer. But I can tell you, there's at least another 50 million of soft costs that we have to deal with. So, you know, we're doing things like twice as many engine changes as we used to do on a smaller fleet. Twice as many. And these are not easy things to do. You just don't sort of rock up and stand under the wing of a 787 and say, let's drop the engine off. So we're doing twice as many of those. A good example, you know, I mentioned I flew up to Vancouver. So I jump on the plane on Sunday and we fly up there and great flight.
I've done it. It is a great flight.
Talking to the pilots as we got off, and I said, you know, what's your roster now? Are you going to be around on Wednesday? Because I'm flying back on Wednesday. And they said, no, we're passengering back tomorrow.
That's a waste of money, isn't it?
I said, why are we doing that? And of course, the reason is they're 777 pilots. So we took a 777 up on Wednesday because we're having to adjust our fleet to make every single flying hour count, it's a Dreamliner that's going up, a 7-8.
And they can't fly it.
No. Some pilots can, these ones couldn't. So that's an idea of a soft cost that we're dealing with. Now, can I tell you, it's really frustrating for our customers, isn't it? Because, you know, I thought I was going to be on a 777 and I was going to sit in sort of 3C, but now that's been changed to 6F, and, you know, so frustrating for customers and frustrating for our Air New Zealand team as they have to deal with that complexity. But guess what? We're doing it. By and large, the network is intact. There wouldn't be too many airlines who have the percentage of fleet impacted that we do anywhere around the world. Our competitors don't. So, you know, Virgin aren't suffering this, Qantas aren't suffering this, Singapore Airlines aren't suffering this, United Airlines. Now they may, but it just so happens that some of the choices we've made many years ago, and it is what it is, you know, we picked Trent 1000 engines. If you didn't pick a Trent, your other option was a GE engine. If you'd picked a GE engine, you're smiling. If you picked a Trent, you're not. So it is what it is. You got to deal with it, and it will pass.
Well, I wanted to ask you about exactly that, because it is the result, while it's largely outside of your control, and as you say, it's a gamble about who you go for with engines and manufacturing at that time. But is it not a feature risk of the fleet simplification program that began many years ago? And how does that now change the way that you might think about manufacturing part decisions going forward, given how this one is aged?
Sure. So this is all a matter of degrees, but boy, these are important decisions. So, you know, I'm glad you've asked the question. Does it make sense for an airline of our size with sort of circa 25 wide bodies to be running a fleet of wide bodies from Airbus and a fleet of wide bodies from Boeing? Probably not. Now, if you had 50 planes, you might say, I need to split that one. But the cost of then running a different set of tools, a different set of engineering requirements, a different set of seat parts, a different set of, you know, flow and service on board the plane and cabin crew, you would say to yourself, on an airline running 25 or so wide bodies, pick one and try and pick the right one. Now, does that mean that you should say, I'm going to run with Boeing across my entire fleet? Well, you actually don't have to, and we haven't. So we've got Boeing on the wide bodies, and we've got Airbus on the single aisles. And I think that's a great choice. Made before my time, but what a really good choice by the company to do that. And then on the turboprops, of which we run just over 50, we've got ATR and we've got de Havilland. So I think what you're seeing Air New Zealand do is making really good choices where there's a degree of simplification, which helps, but just enough diversification that we don't have quite all our eggs in one basket.
In part 2 of this episode, Greg Foran reveals his surprise at Auckland Airport's $1.4 billion capital raise.
This is not a small spend.
And shares how he's dealing with his own unhappy customers.
I can't please every person who travels on Air New Zealand Madison. I try, but I can't.
What does it feel like to run an airline that everyone thinks can run better than you can? Stay tuned for part 2 next week. Thanks for watching Markets with Madison. If you enjoyed this interview, please hit the like and subscribe buttons below. I do all of the research for these episodes myself, so your support means a lot. I always love to hear your feedback and ideas, so please drop any thoughts in the comments below. Now go put your money to work.